And we round out the prolonged look at the Iowa class with USS Wisconsin, clearing the way for the promised further detailed reviews on some of the Essex-class carriers. Her keel would be laid down on the 25th of January 1941 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She was launched on the 7th of December 1943 and commissioned on the 16th of April 1944. Numerically, her hull number of BB-64 is the highest of any battleship ever built for the United States Navy, but due to the delays with the construction of the USS Missouri, Wisconsin would actually commission before her sister ship. She was of course armed as her sisters were, with 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 superfiring forward and 1 aft, a secondary battery of 25-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in twin turrets, 5 to a side, and a good production run's worth of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, made up a total of 148 anti-aircraft capable gun barrels. As with the other Iowas, she arrived somewhat late in World War II, with a shakedown cruise and the inevitable alterations and repairs, meaning she wouldn't reach the active combat zone until the 9th of December 1944, when she joined Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet in the Caroline Islands. With many of Japan's island conquests having already fallen, the ship came into action in the middle of the liberation of the Philippines, and so she was assigned to protect Fast Carrier Task Force 38, her 33-knot top speed allowing her to keep up with the carriers even during flight operations. Along with many other ships, she would be struck by Typhoon Cobra in the middle of a refueling at sea exercise, but would come through with only 2 injured sailors and minimal damage, in contrast to a number of other ships, which included 3 destroyers lost with almost all hands. Recovering from this battering, Task Force 38 went on to support the various landings before moving north to try and tempt out the last remaining units of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This included raids on ports and harbours, sinking and destroying ships, docks, warehouses, and airfields. TF-38 was then reformed as TF-58 and headed for Tokyo, destroying hundreds of Japanese aircraft as Wisconsin dutifully saw off air raids and kamikaze strikes with its huge anti-aircraft battery. It bears mentioning at this point that Task Force 38 and Task Force 58 are actually the same force, the American Fast Carrier Task Force. Basically, when they were assigned to one admiral, they were known by one designation, and when they were assigned to another admiral, they were known as by the other designation. Rather unhelpfully, for continuity, this means that Task Force 38 would become Task Force 58, and then revert back to Task Force 38 later on in the war. They would then move briefly to Iwo Jima to support the landings there before returning to do more damage off the Japanese coast, with the primary objective of reducing Japan's capacity to counterattack the landings on Okinawa. Despite her best efforts, however, Wisconsin could not prevent the carrier Franklin from being badly damaged, despite assisting in the destruction of dozens of attacking aircraft, and so the task force would retire from the Japanese shore to protect and escort the Franklin. With that done, Wisconsin would engage in the traditional activity of US battleships in the late Pacific War, shore bombardment, as the landings on Okinawa continued. The Japanese launched Operation 10 Go to try and disrupt this effort, and sadly for battleship fans everywhere, the Americans did not send Wisconsin and the other battleships of the task force to engage the Yamato in glorious combat, but instead took the pragmatic approach of throwing several hundred aircraft at her until she sank. With a number of the task force's fighters off happily shooting up the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ability to stop incoming air attack on their own ships was somewhat reduced, and the fleet carrier USS Hancock was hit by a kamikaze strike. After Yamato's sinking, the full fighter strength was available again, but the Japanese ramped up their attacks, scoring hits on Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and Enterprise over the next few days. Only the combined efforts of the fighter pilots and the screen's massive AA barrage kept those and other carriers from being destroyed, and dozens more attackers that got past the fighters were gunned down on final approach by the gun crews aboard the escorting ships, including, of course, Wisconsin. Surviving another typhoon, the Wisconsin found its group's final assaults meeting little resistance, the Japanese having apparently finally started running out of both aircraft and fuel for the ones they had left, as Wisconsin recommenced a direct assault on the Japanese home islands. Throughout the summer, Wisconsin would combine her 16-inch guns with the firepower of the British battleships of the British Pacific Fleet to wipe out a number of military and industrial targets. She would arrive in Tokyo Bay 3 days after the formal surrender and would then take part in Operation Magic Carpet, receive an overhaul with repairs and alterations, which would then see her head to South America and Europe for training cruises in 1946 and 1947, before being placed in reserve in 1948. She would only be there briefly, however, being brought back into service in 1950 as the Korean War broke out. Although in a trend she seemed to share with a number of US battleships, including some of her sisters, she managed to run aground off the US coast, somewhat delaying her departure. She would eventually reach the Korean coast and take up bombardment duties, amongst other things managing to severely overkill one of the few enemy tanks on the peninsula with a 16-inch round, plus supplying starshell illumination to assist in driving back a number of enemy troop attacks. Bunkers, supply and command posts, artillery, trenches, enemy troop concentrations, and some enemy boats would all fall to her main battery and 5-inch guns over the following months, whilst occasionally hosting a US senator. Towards the end of this assignment, she would take the first direct hit she'd ever received as a shell from a 6-inch gun battery hit one of the 40mm anti-aircraft gun installations, injuring 3 men. The reply, in the form of a full 16-inch high-explosive broadside, rather decisively settled the issue of who had the bigger guns. Heading home, she would test out the United States Navy's first Iowa-capable floating dry dock successfully, before resuming duties as a training ship in the Atlantic, mostly based out of Scotland, before heading back across the globe in 1953 to visit Japan and Hong Kong, before being sent back again to the Atlantic Fleet on further training cruises, before accidentally grounding again in 1955. A somewhat more serious incident would occur in May 1956 when the ship was operating off the US coast in heavy fog and would accidentally ram the destroyer USS Eaton. This had a rather negative effect on the ship's forward profile, and so as not to miss her scheduled summer training cruise, the bow of the incomplete Kentucky was carefully clipped off and taken in one piece to the Norfolk Navy Yard, where the old bow was removed and the new one installed in just 16 days. Further training cruises in the Mediterranean and Atlantic followed, with an interesting diversion in 1957 to sink a Stratofreighter aircraft that had ditched due to engine failure, but then spent the next week floating happily around the Atlantic and posing a hazard to navigation. By 1958, however, the training cruising days were over, and the ship would be placed in reserve storage alongside the Iowa, bypassing the Vietnam War, although a subsequent electrical fire would leave her in the worst condition of the 4 Iowas when the call for reactivation would come in the 1980s. But she would still receive that modernisation alongside the other 3, losing the 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns, as well as a couple of 5-inch turrets, receiving replacement weapons in the form of 4 quad launchers for Harpoon missiles, 8 quad launchers for Tomahawk cruise missiles, and 4 20mm Phalanx CIWS systems. 8 RQ-2 Pioneer UAVs for main gun spotting and recon replaced helicopters, and a new electronic warfare suite was fitted. She would be formally back in service in 1988, joining the fleet as part of her very own surface action group. Alongside Missouri, the ship would launch cruise missile strikes on Iraq during the First Gulf War, along with shore bombardment missions primarily targeting artillery, missile launcher and attack boat positions along the Iraqi coast. As the Allied counteroffensive commenced, the 2 battleships took part in a diversionary attack. During this period, one of the drone operators was told to fly the drone low over Iraqi positions so that they understood what was about to happen, as the ships themselves were over the horizon and out of sight. Recognizing the sound of the drone, and having seen what an earlier strike by Missouri had done, the targeted troops promptly surrendered to the drone, which marked a bit of a first in naval history. After accepting the surrender, the victorious drone was then recalled to the ship, presumably for a celebratory oiling. The ship would then carry out a few more bombardment missions, becoming most likely the last battleship in the world to see action, as Wisconsin fired her final salvo in February 1991 as the war drew to a close. In September of the same year, she would be decommissioned back into the reserve fleet after a total of 14 years active service, although limited public access was allowed starting in 2001. In 2006, the ship was formally removed from the reserve register, but Congress followed this with a law requiring the ship, alongside another Iowa class, was to be maintained in such a way as to allow them to be returned to active duty if needed. 3 years later, at the end of 2009, the ship was officially transferred to the city of Norfolk, finally removing the requirement for the ship to be ready for active duty and making her the very last theoretically operational battleship in the world. She would then become fully open as a museum and entered the list of historic places in 2012, and of course can still be visited today.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.